Imagine this. You are in Rome, the beating heart of the greatest empire the world has ever seen. It is the summer of 64 AD. A city is alive with music, trade, feasting, and whispers of political intrigue. But in just a matter of hours, everything will change. A spark no larger than a candle flame will ignite one of the most destructive disasters in human history, the Great Fire of Rome. And at the center of this inferno, Emperor Nero, a ruler whose name will forever be tied to flames, suspicion, and persecution. Was Nero a victim of circumstance, or the villain who let his empire burn? This is the story of a fire that reshaped Rome, and a moment that would forever alter the fate of Christianity. Rome in the first century was unlike any other city on earth. With nearly 1 million people, it was the beating heart of the empire. Crowded, noisy, alive at all hours, Rome was a place where senators debated the empire's future, while beggars scraped coins from the dust of cobblestones. The narrow streets twisted like a maze. Multi-story wooden tenements, called insulae, rose dangerously high, stacked one upon another like fragile tinderboxes. These apartments were cheap, overcrowded, and notoriously flammable. Oil lamps lit every room. Open cooking fires burned day and night. And merchants stored flammable goods like oils, hay, and cloth in their cramped shops. The people of Rome lived under constant threat, if not from disease or riots, then from fire. Small blazes were common, but nothing prepared them for what was about to come. At the center of this empire stood Emperor Nero. Just 26 years old, Nero was unlike his predecessors. Charismatic, unpredictable, obsessed with the arts, and despised by the Senate, Nero wanted to be remembered not as a politician or warrior, but as a performer, a man of culture. He fancied himself a poet, a singer, even an actor. To many Romans, this was shocking, even disgraceful for an emperor. But Nero's Rome was also one of ambition. The emperor dreamed of reshaping the city with grand monuments, wide boulevards, and palaces fit for gods. There was just one problem. The Rome that existed was too crowded, too chaotic, too old. And some whispered, even before the flames, that Nero longed to clear the city to rebuild it in his image. It was the night of July 18th, 64 AD. A hot, dry wind swept through the city. In the tightly packed district of the Circus Maximus, Rome's great chariot racing arena fire broke out in shops filled with flammable goods. At first, it was small, a single blaze licking at wooden stalls. But the winds carried sparks into the night sky, dropping flames onto rooftops. Within hours, the fire spread uncontrollably. Eyewitness accounts describe chaos beyond imagination. The fire leapt across narrow streets, consuming everything in its path. The wooden insulae collapsed like kindling. Families fled with what they could carry, some clutching children, others dragging furniture only, to find themselves trapped as the inferno cut off escape routes. The fire raged for days. For 6 nights and 7 days, Rome burned. The screams of the trapped echoed through alleyways. Statues melted. Marble cracked in the heat. The sky glowed red, as if the gods themselves had set the empire ablaze. Ancient historian Tacitus writes of shrieking women, aged men, and people of every condition, all striving to save themselves, some dragging the infirm, others awaiting their doom, all bewildered in the same instant. Even as Rome's citizens fought to survive, questions began to arise. Where was Nero? When word of the fire reached the emperor, Nero was at his villa in Antium, miles away from the city. He returned to Rome as flames engulfed the capital. According to some accounts, Nero immediately organized relief efforts. He opened his palaces to the homeless, arranged for food distribution, and personally directed firefighting. Yet rumors spread like smoke. Some whispered that Nero himself had ordered the fire. Others claimed they saw imperial guards preventing citizens from extinguishing flames, ensuring the fire spread further. The most infamous story? That Nero, watching from his palace as the city burned, sang about the fall of Troy while playing his lyre. Nero fiddled while Rome burned, a phrase that would echo through history. But is it true? Ancient sources disagree. Tacitus himself admits he could not confirm it. The image of Nero serenading the destruction may have been a weapon of propaganda crafted by his enemies. But whether true or false, the rumor stuck, and it would forever shape Nero's legacy. When the flames finally died, Rome was unrecognizable. 2/3 of the city lay in ashes. 10 of Rome's 14 districts were destroyed or damaged. Thousands were dead, countless more homeless. The people were furious, and anger needs a target. Many blamed Nero. The emperor's dream of rebuilding the city with his own grand designs suddenly looked suspicious. To deflect blame, Nero needed a scapegoat, and he found one in a small, controversial sect, the Christians. Rome was a city of many gods. Jupiter, Mars, Venus, Apollo temples filled every district, and religious rituals were woven into daily life. For Romans, honoring the gods was not optional. It was essential to the survival of the empire. But there was a group that refused. A small, secretive sect scattered throughout the empire who worshipped only one god. They rejected Roman festivals, ignored sacrifices, and refused to bow before the emperor's image. They called themselves Christians. By 64 AD, Christianity was still young, barely 3 decades after the crucifixion of Jesus. In Rome, Christians were a misunderstood minority. Their rituals were rumored to be dark and strange. Romans whispered about secret gatherings, love feasts, and cannibalistic rites involving the body and blood of their savior. When the Great Fire destroyed the city, Nero seized his chance. If he could redirect public rage toward the Christians, he could escape blame. Tacitus, writing just a generation later, tells us plainly, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. And so began one of the first great persecutions in Christian history. The punishments were brutal. Christians were arrested in waves, dragged from their homes, and paraded before jeering crowds. Some were torn apart by dogs in the arenas. Others were crucified, hung on wooden beams as the empire's old execution method was revived for new victims. And in perhaps the most grotesque spectacle of all, Nero ordered Christians to be covered in pitch, set aflame, and used as human torches to light his gardens at night. Imagine walking through the imperial gardens and seeing bodies burning like candles in the dark, while Nero strolled among them, hosting feasts, playing music, and entertaining guests. For Christians, this was a moment of terror, but also of transformation. The blood of martyrs became the seed of faith. Stories of their courage spread quietly from Rome to distant provinces, inspiring believers to endure persecution. But for the city of Rome itself, another transformation was underway, one that would reshape the capital forever. With vast portions of the city in ruins, Nero saw an opportunity. He began an ambitious project to rebuild Rome, not as it had been, but as he dreamed it should be. Streets were widened, new regulations enforced to prevent overcrowding, and buildings constructed with brick instead of wood. Rome began to look less like a chaotic sprawl and more like a planned capital. But amid this reconstruction, one project towered above all others: Nero's Domus Aurea, the Golden House. This wasn't just a palace, it was a statement. Sprawling across more than 200 acres, the Golden House glittered with marble, mosaics, fountains, and gardens. Its dining halls had ceilings that could rain down flower petals and perfume. At its entrance stood a colossal bronze statue of Nero himself, nearly 100 feet tall. To the people of Rome, it was obscene. While citizens starved and struggled in the ashes, Nero built himself a palace fit for a god. And so the suspicion deepened. Had Nero started the fire, just to clear land for his dream? The image of Nero watching Rome burn has become immortal. Some see him standing high on Palatine Hill, lyre in hand, singing of Troy's destruction as the city collapsed in flames. Others picture him wandering calmly through the chaos, untouched by grief, obsessed with how this fire might serve his ambition. But history is messy. The ancient sources Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius Dio all give conflicting accounts. Some describe him as cruel and theatrical, others as a leader who genuinely tried to help. What we know is this: Nero's enemies seized upon the fire as the perfect symbol of his tyranny. Whether he truly caused it or not, the narrative stuck. The emperor who let Rome burn. The artist who performed while his people screamed. In truth, history may never solve the mystery. Did Nero ignite the fire? Or was he simply the victim of a disaster that fate, or perhaps the gods, had chosen for Rome? As news of the fire spread across the empire, Rome's prestige faltered. Cities from the provinces sent aid, but whispers carried far. Rome is burning, and Nero is mad. The Senate, already hostile to Nero, found new reasons to despise him. For years, they had tolerated his eccentricities, his acting, his poetry, his wild spending. But now he seemed not just unfit, but dangerous. Behind palace walls, Nero grew increasingly paranoid. He trusted fewer people, executed those who questioned him, and surrounded himself with flatterers. The fire had not just scarred the city, it had scarred the emperor's mind. The great fire of Rome lasted for more than a week, but its consequences burned for generations. For Christians, it was the beginning of centuries of persecution under Roman rule. Yet it also marked the start of their story as a faith that could endure and even thrive under oppression. For Rome, it was both tragedy and rebirth. The city rose from ashes with stronger foundations, wider roads, and new monuments. And for Nero, it was the moment that defined his reign. Whether or not he started the fire, it consumed his reputation. When his enemies finally rose against him just a few years later, the people remembered the flames. They remembered the palace, the cruelty, the rumors. And Nero, once emperor of the greatest city on earth, fled into hiding, abandoned and despised, before taking his own life. But the fire? The fire never died. Because whenever we speak of Rome, of emperors and legacies, one image still rises above all. A city in flames, and an emperor with a lyre, playing while the world burned. The morning after the flames finally subsided, the city resembled a battlefield. The once proud capital of the empire looked like a wasteland of rubble and smoke. Columns were toppled, temples blackened, and statues of gods lay shattered among the ashes. Survivors wandered aimlessly, their eyes hollow from grief. Mothers searched desperately for children. Old men sat silently before the ruins of homes that had stood for generations. And in the air-thick, choking smoke, the smell of charred wood and human remains. Out of nearly 1 million citizens, tens of thousands were now homeless. The few districts spared were flooded with refugees. The Forum, once a place of debate and law, became a camp for the dispossessed. And above all this destruction, the words on everyone's lips. Why? Some claimed it was the wrath of the gods. Others muttered of conspiracies. But the name most often spoken in the whispers was Nero. In fairness to Nero, he did act. Ancient sources, even those hostile to him, acknowledged that the emperor opened his own gardens as temporary housing. Food was imported and distributed at lower prices. Nero personally oversaw emergency measures to prevent famine. But kindness has little weight when suspicion already poisons the air. For every loaf of bread he gave away, the people remembered the golden house rising on the ashes of their neighborhoods. For every relief measure, the rumor of Nero the arsonist spread further. Some claimed they saw imperial agents torching buildings to widen the fire's reach. Others swore soldiers prevented citizens from saving their homes. Was this paranoia or a glimpse of truth? Nero's relief efforts may have saved lives, but they did not save his reputation. The persecution of Christians that followed was not merely punishment, it was theater. Public trials were staged to show the empire who the true culprits were. Prisoners were dragged before magistrates, forced to confess crimes they did not commit. Torture wrung out false admissions. Crowds packed amphitheaters, eager for vengeance. To them, these Christians were enemies of Rome's strange, defiant people who rejected the empire's gods. If they were guilty of burning the city, then their suffering was just. And so the spectacles began. Some Christians were sewn into animal skins and thrown to wild dogs. Others were nailed to crosses along the Appian Way, their bodies lined like warning posts outside the city. But the most haunting were those who became Nero's living torches. At night, in his private gardens, they were burned alive to illuminate feasts and games. Guests described a ghastly sight, rows of flaming bodies, casting light across fountains and statues, while Nero entertained them with poetry and music. To Roman elites, it was grotesque but effective propaganda. The Christians bore the blame. To Christians themselves, it was the beginning of martyrdom, the fire that would not consume but strengthen their faith. Amid tragedy, Rome changed forever. Nero issued new building codes, forbidding wooden beams in construction and mandating brick or stone walls. Streets were widened, and fire breaks created to slow future disasters. The chaos of narrow, winding alleys gave way to more ordered boulevards. For the first time, Rome began to resemble the planned city Nero envisioned. Yet this rebirth came at a terrible cost. The reconstruction drained the treasury. Taxes increased, straining provinces already weary of Roman rule. Governors complained, rebellions stirred. What Nero saw as a dream, others saw as a tyrant's indulgence. And towering above it all was the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. The sheer extravagance of it left Rome in awe and disgust. Where once humble homes stood, a sprawling palace glittered with gold leaf, jeweled ceilings, and artificial lakes. To the common Roman, it was simple. Their misery had paved the way for the emperor's luxury. Why, then, did the rumor of Nero singing while Rome burned endure so powerfully? The answer lies in the emperor's obsession with myth. Nero fancied himself a new Orpheus, a singer whose music could charm beasts and bend nature. He adored Greek epics, especially Homer's tale of Troy. As Rome burned, some claimed, he performed the sac of Ilium, singing of Troy's destruction as his own capital fell. Was it symbolic, arrogant? Or perhaps Nero genuinely saw himself not as a villain, but as an artist standing within history's stage play. To him, the fire was tragedy. To the people, it was blasphemy. In Roman culture, an emperor was supposed to be a warrior, a statesman, a guardian of tradition. To strum a lyre while the city perished was not just bizarre, it was un-Roman. And so the story lived on, repeated until it became inseparable from Nero's name. The Great Fire didn't just destroy Rome, it destroyed Nero's peace of mind. Though he had crushed suspicion by blaming the Christians, doubt lingered. Senators whispered in corridors. Aristocrats rolled their eyes at his theatrical ambitions. The common people, forced to pay higher taxes for reconstruction, grumbled louder than ever. Nero grew paranoid. Anyone who questioned him could be accused of conspiracy. Old friends became enemies overnight. Even his closest advisors were not safe. He executed his own mother, Agrippina, years before, and the shadow of that act still haunted him. Now, in the wake of the fire, he turned on senators, poets, generals, anyone who might rival him. The man who once dreamed of being adored as a performer was now feared as a tyrant. And yet, life in Rome went on. The circus games continued, temples were rebuilt, markets reopened. To an outsider, the city looked alive again, perhaps even stronger after reconstruction. But beneath the surface, a contradiction festered. Rome was dazzling, with new streets, monuments, and a shining golden house. Yet the people lived with resentment. The more Nero performed as a singer and actor, the less they respected him as emperor. For Romans, the stage was for slaves and professionals, not rulers. When Nero appeared in theaters, competing in musical contests, the crowds were forced to applaud. His victories were guaranteed. But in private, mockery spread. The fire had not just scarred the city, it had revealed the cracks in Nero's rule. Far beyond Rome, in the vast provinces of the empire, discontent was rising. Governors resented the heavy taxation for Nero's building projects. Legions on distant frontiers grumbled at lack of pay. The empire stretched from Britain to Egypt, Spain to Syria. And yet, the emperor seemed more interested in his music than in governance. The fire and Nero's obsession with rebuilding convinced many that Rome's leader had lost touch with reality. In Spain, in Gaul, in the east, whispers grew into plots. The provinces would not forget Nero's extravagance, nor the spectacle of Christians burning in his gardens. In 68 AD, just 4 years after the Great Fire, Nero's enemies struck. Governors in Gaul and Spain rebelled. The Senate turned against him. Even the Praetorian Guard, his personal protectors, abandoned him. When the news reached Nero, he panicked. The once powerful emperor, master of Rome, found himself alone. He fled the city he had reshaped, disguised and trembling. In a villa outside Rome, with soldiers closing in, Nero faced the end. Qualis artifex perio. He cried, "What an artist dies in me." With those words, he drove a dagger into his throat. The emperor who had ruled Rome during its most devastating fire was gone. He was the first Roman emperor to take his own life. But the fire he left behind still burned in memory. The Great Fire of Rome was more than a disaster. It was a turning point. For Rome, it brought destruction, but also rebirth. Nero's rebuilding efforts left a mark on the city's structure, shaping it into a capital of stone rather than wood. His golden house was despised, yet parts of it survived centuries, buried beneath later emperors' monuments. For Christians, the fire marked their first great trial. The persecution under Nero became legendary, their martyrs celebrated as heroes of faith. What Nero intended as extermination became, in time, a foundation for growth. And for history, the fire became inseparable from Nero's name. Whether he truly said it or not, whether he truly sang as Rome burned, his image is forever framed in flames. The Great Fire of Rome reminds us of a truth. Disasters do not just destroy cities, they reshape legacies. They turn rulers into tyrants, victims into martyrs, and tragedies into legends. And as long as we remember Rome, we will remember the night the empire burned. The fire was recorded by Rome's historians, though each told the story through different lenses. Tacitus, writing decades later, described the horror in stark detail: families running into flames, temples collapsing, chaos without end. Yet he admitted he could not confirm whether Nero caused the fire. Still, Tacitus gave us the story of Christians suffering exquisite punishments under the emperor's hand. Suetonius, more hostile to Nero, painted him as a monster who delighted in cruelty. According to him, Nero joked as Rome burned, treating tragedy as a stage play. Cassius Dio, writing even later, echoed these accounts with added drama, describing a city that looked as if the whole world had fallen into fire. Eyewitnesses likely saw fragments flames leaping from roofs, neighbors screaming, soldiers dragging people away. But their voices, gathered and retold, created the legend we remember. Not just a fire, but a crime against humanity. For Christians, the fire became a marker of identity. Though still a small sect in 64, their stories of martyrdom under Nero echoed for centuries. Early church writers described Peter and Paul both meeting their deaths in Rome. During Nero's reign, Peter crucified upside down, Paul beheaded as a Roman citizen. Whether directly tied to the fire or not, these deaths became part of the same narrative. Nero, the persecutor, and Rome, the city that tried to crush the faith. But Christianity did not die. Instead, it grew. In catacombs beneath the city, Christians gathered in secret, preserving stories of martyrs. They remembered how believers had faced beasts and fire, not with terror, but with hope. The great fire, meant to erase them, instead gave them a legacy of endurance. In Roman culture, fire was both feared and revered. Sacred flames burned in temples. The eternal flame of Vesta was guarded by priestesses, ensuring Rome's protection. But the great fire transformed flame from a symbol of purity into a memory of horror. To Romans, it was proof of vulnerability, that even the greatest empire could be reduced to ash overnight. To Christians, fire became a symbol of trial by faith. The burning of their brothers and sisters was seen not as defeat, but as purification. Just as gold is refined in fire, so too, they believed, was their faith strengthened. And in the centuries that followed, Christian writers would cast Nero not simply as an emperor, but as a beast, even a forerunner of the Antichrist. His name would live in infamy, while their faith lived on. Nero's successors understood the weight of the fire's memory. Emperor Vespasian, who rose after Nero's death, buried much of the Golden House beneath new public works. On the site of Nero's artificial lake, he built the Colosseum, a gift to the people, a monument to entertainment and Roman pride. In this way, the fire indirectly gave birth to one of Rome's most iconic structures. Later emperors used the memory of Nero as a warning. When Domitian sought to expand his palaces, critics compared him to Nero. When Christians were persecuted, again under other rulers, writers recalled the first flames in Nero's gardens. The fire had become more than an event. It was a moral lesson, wielded by both historians and politicians. The Great Fire of 64 AD was not the last disaster to strike Rome. Earthquakes, invasions, and plagues would come. Yet Rome endured for centuries after Nero, reshaped again and again by rulers who built on its ruins. But that 1 week of flames left an eternal scar. It revealed the fragility of empires. It exposed the ambition and madness of a ruler. And it set in motion one of history's great paradoxes. By trying to destroy the Christians, Nero ensured their story would outlive him. Today, we walk among Rome's ruins, the Colosseum, the Forum, the buried chambers of Nero's Golden House. And beneath our feet lies the memory of that inferno. A city reduced to ashes, a people searching for meaning, an emperor consumed by suspicion, and a faith that turned persecution into strength. The great fire of Rome is more than history. It is a reminder that power is fleeting, that legacies are shaped not only by what rulers build, but by what they destroy. And so we end where we began in the summer of 64 AD, when a single flame, carried by the wind, lit up the night sky and changed the world forever. Rome burned, but from its ashes, history was reborn.